if you saw last week's video, I showed you how to scale, rotate, and move a pattern in your flat sketch. This week, I'm going to show you two final steps to really get the pattern looking very realistic. The first step is to do something called envelope distort, and the second step is to add a few shadows. So let's get started. I'm going to use the same skirt I used in the last video with the bias stripe pattern, and all I want to do is put a little rippling into the stripe so that the stripe reflects the fullness of the skirt. And sidebar, when you use envelope distort, you can change the settings so that what we're about to do can be performed on a pattern fill. However, I don't recommend it. There will be some distortion, but when it's performed directly on a pattern fill, it can sometimes break apart your pattern, as you can see here. So instead, what I do is I draw a box with the pattern in it. I draw it right on top, and I'll make it a little taller than the shape it's going into. They should exactly match the placement you originally had, and you can automatically do that by sampling the skirt pattern with your eyedropper. Next, you're going to rasterize your rectangle using 150 ppi resolution, a transparent background, and art-optimized anti-aliasing. Envelope distort is simply a way to reshape an object, and you can use a shape you've drawn, preset warp shapes like the ones found in the effects panel, or you can do it with mesh. For this tutorial, we're going to use mesh because it's going to give us the most control. You're going to go to the object menu, to envelope distort, and then make with mesh. Once the dialog box appears, choose the number of rows and columns you want to start with to create the mesh. I recommend starting with a small number. You can always add more later with the mesh tool. Click the preview box in the lower left-hand corner to get an idea of what the object's going to look like, and then press OK to start working with the mesh. The first thing I'm going to do is give the skirt a little bit of perspective at the top. This is not something you have to do, it's just my preference. I'm going to use the free transform tool and then choose the free distort option, and I'm just going to pull in the top part of the mesh. Then I'm going to move the whole thing to realign the stripes. Next, I'm going to switch to my direct selection tool to start manipulating the mesh. I want to create some vertical drape in the skirt, so I'm going to start moving the vertical dots. What you do is click on the dots and move them in the direction you want to see the drape. And as you move the dots, as well as the direction handles, it manipulates the look of the fabric. Using the mesh tool, click on a vertical line to add a horizontal row and vice versa. And this is going to give you additional control to manipulate the pattern. Make sure the column of dots is somewhat close to where you want to see the drape. You don't want to stretch them too much, otherwise you'll distort the pattern. And you can see a little bit of that happening here with that mesh texture in the print. So to avoid this or to fix it, you can add an additional column or row nearby, and that'll help keep the texture or pull that texture back together. Another thing you want to keep in mind here, less is more. Don't add in too many columns or rows, and don't go crazy trying to add more wrinkles. As you can see here, I only have a few rows and columns, and it's enough to give that extra feeling of the fullness and drape in your skirt. Once you're done manipulating the fabric, you want to get it inside the skirt shape. Select the mesh object, cut it, then choose the shape it's going to go into. Switch to draw inside mode and paste it in place. And now you'll really get to see how this pattern looks inside the skirt. And you can do any additional tweaking with your direct selection tool if necessary. So now that I've created the draping, I'm going to add a little bit of shadow to finish this up. You can see here I already started with a shadow on my sketch, but I'm going to show you how I created them, and you guys, it's really, really easy. Now before you start this, you might want to lock the mesh object in the wrinkle lines just so that it's easier to see what you're doing. Use the pencil tool or the pen tool, whichever you're more comfortable with, and draw a thin crescent shape right next to the wrinkle line. Make sure it's filled with a light shade of gray. I'm using 35%. And from the transparency panel, change the blending mode to multiply and bring down the opacity so the shadow is subtle and you can see more of the pattern through the gray object. Repeat this for the other wrinkle lines, and be sure to go back and thin out the object so your shadows don't look too thick. The shadows are a pretty simple addition, but it's definitely a nice extra finishing touch that brings out a bit more dimension in your Illustrator sketch. So that's your digital fashion tip for this week. What'd you think? Let me know in the comments section below. Would you use this? Is it worth the extra time to use the mesh tool? I'm interested in your thoughts. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic week, and I'll see you on 7th Avenue.